Good morning and welcome. I'm Celeste and this is my channel Celeste Creates, where I share cross stitch and stitching on my floss tube videos. I share all things quilty on my QuiltyTube videos, and today I am back for video number 2 in my Let's Begin Quilting series that I started a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for joining me again. Today is Monday, August 30th, 2021, and it is hot and sunny, but feeling kind of pleasant here in the Houston area. I had hoped to get this video filmed a little sooner than this, but the past 2 weeks have just been really full of getting my oldest son gone to college and getting my daughter up to college, and we got that taken care of. Go Ravens. And then kind of recovering from our trip to Kansas, as well as starting school with my 3 that are still at home last week. So anyway, I'd hope to do it sooner, but here I am, and let's continue quilting. Let's get moving on making our blocks. So in my first video, which you can find here on my channel, we worked through taking our 8 fat quarter bundle. We pressed our fat quarters, we cut and sorted our fat quarters into rectangles of a certain size, and all that was in preparation for today. We're going to start piecing our blocks. The video after this, we will start arranging our blocks for our small quilt. I'd had a couple questions about the size of this quilt and whether it can be adjusted. The size of the quilt that we're making with these 8 fat quarters is what I would consider a baby quilt size. So it's about 4 feet by 4 feet. It's going to be closer, I think, to 40 by 48. So a nice size for draping over the back of a small chair, or for a table topper, or wall hanging, or a baby quilt. And yes, if you have more fat quarters and you continue to cut rectangles in the way that I showed you in the first video, you can make more blocks and continue adding to the size of the quilt. So really it is quite adjustable, because you're just cutting rectangles, and it takes 3 of those rectangles to make a block, as you'll see here in just a moment. So yeah, it's very adjustable, but the quilt that we're making with these 8 fat quarters isn't a large quilt. It is about 40 by 48. So I think I said it in the first video, I wanted to make it a little bit smaller so that it's just not overwhelming. I think everything that we're doing on this very small quilt is then transferable to making a larger quilt, whether it's with this block or squares or any other block that you want to try and attempt. But it made it easier to show you how to lay things out in the next couple of videos. It's going to be easier for me to show you how to pin, how to free motion quilt, and then you can take that and apply these skills afterward to a larger quilt that you want to attempt. So that's why I'm keeping it smaller. But yes, the more rectangles you cut, the more blocks you make, and you're just going to end up, it'll get bigger and bigger. So we're going to end up making 48 blocks today. So imagine if you had 16 fat quarters, you'd have 96 blocks. Kind of break that up into, you know, rows and columns, and you'd have a little bit bigger quilt. So hopefully at the end of the video here, I can show you a little bit of the math of what would happen with every additional fat quarter, if that makes sense. But first I want to get to the meat of the video today, which is piecing our rectangles into the block that we're going to use to make our quilt top. All right, so let me turn the camera around, and let's, I'm going to relocate over to my cutting table to begin with, and we're going to get started on talking about making our blocks. As we get started today, I want to give you a little bit of a refresher or reminder about what we did in our first video. In that video, we took all of our fat quarters and we did our pressing and cutting. And so if you remember correctly, a fat quarter measures 18 inches by 21 inches. And we took each of our 8 fat quarters that we had and we cut those each into 18 3-inch by 5.5 inch rectangles. So every fat quarter, all 8 fat quarters yielded the 18, so 3 times 6 is 18 of these rectangles that measured 3 by 5.5. And I included this as a PDF, this paper, in the first video in the drop down box, and I will try and remember and include it again as well in today's video. Along with the paper that I will show you here in a few minutes about our block. So that's what we did last time. And if you got your cutting done, then this is what you ended up with. So these are my blue and white fat quarters that I'd gotten from the Etsy shop, Cottage Couture fabrics. And but these aren't, remember, these are not the fat quarters that you have to use. You could have pulled 8 different multicolored fat quarters. You could have mixed pinks and reds, or any combination of fat quarters, or found a cute fat quarter bundle somewhere else on Etsy or in a fabric shop. And so it's really up to you to just play with these fabrics that you've chosen and have fun. I know some of you are using these adorable English Garden fat quarters that I had found on Etsy. And so you can see here that I have 8 stacks. We sorted these into stacks at the end of the video. I have 8 stacks, so each stack represents 1 fat quarter, and each stack is my 18 rectangles that I cut last time. So I had 3 dark blue fat quarters, I had 2 light blue fat quarters, and I had 3 white background fat quarters. So each stack is from 1 fat quarter. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to start taking these fabrics and we are going to be building our blocks. And this really isn't supposed to have a whole lot of rhyme or reason. This is supposed to be scrappy, fun, because by the time you've made all your blocks and you start laying them out for your quilt top, you're going to have enough variety that you're just going to have a real fun arrangement. And I'll give you some tips as we go along as how you might match up your rectangles to make your blocks. So these are our cut rectangles, and today we're going to make our blocks. So let me show you I had made a prototype block. Let me grab that and show you what I had made. I had made this block from 3 Lori Holt fabrics that I like, just out of my stash. So these are 3 of the 3 by 5.5 rectangles sewn together, and this was my prototype. And as you can see, just a really fun, cute block, and super easy to make, and very versatile. You'll see in the next video as to how you can lay it out and create some different layouts. So this is what your blocks, all 48 of them, should look like by the time you're finished with making all your blocks after this video. So that's what the block looks like. And then here, like I said, I have another, just a simple diagram for you like you might find in a quilt pattern. And I will include this as a PDF in the drop down box below. But what it shows is a picture of the one block that I just showed you. So this block here that I made, this is the diagram for that block. So you can do a screenshot of it right now, or you can go download it from the drop down box and print that out for yourself. So you can see here, we're going to make 48 of these. We're going to make 48 of this one block. And it's going to be scrappy, and it's going to be fun, and you're just going to love putting it together. It's so easy. We're going to do some chain piecing, and so I'm excited to get to show you some of that. So as you can see from the diagram, the first thing we're going to do, and I'll tell you this while we look at the diagram, and I'll also show it to you as we sew. But we're going to sew 2 rectangles together. We're going to make 48 of those. We're going to sew 2 of them together for 48 little pieces. So we're going to join these 2 first. And then once we press this seam, we're going to add this rectangle up here, and we'll end up with 48 of these blocks. As always, if you have any questions about what I'm doing, or maybe things I've left out, please do not hesitate to email me or leave me a comment below. I'm thrilled to answer your questions. So happy to get to do this video series with you. So don't think you're bothering me at all. It is super fun to get to help you through this process. So that's our diagram. And so let's look here at the blue and white fabrics that I have. Talking about placement and how we're going to construct these blocks. I have 3 different shades of blue here. So I've got my 3 darks, even though this one right here, this blue is actually just a hair lighter than these 2. I have these paler blues, and then I have these blue and whites. And so as we join the bottom 2 pieces of our block, we're going to make it scrappy, but I'm going to talk about how we can have a little bit of rhyme or reason as we put those together, because as you can see, we have more dark blue and white blocks or rectangles than we do light blue. And so as you piece those together, we're not going to actually lay them out and plan our blocks. We are just going to start sewing. But as you put them together, what you might consider is using, as you pair the 2 rectangles at the bottom here, as you pair that, using more of the dark and the white on the bottom here. Yes, you're going to want to throw in some of these lights on the bottom as well, but since you have fewer of those, it might be helpful to use more of the darks and more of the whites on those bottom sections. So what I want to talk to you about for just a minute is some of the quilting math. Now, when you purchase a pattern from a quilt pattern designer, or even use a free pattern that someone has provided on the internet, they've done the quilting math for you, and so you really don't have to put this kind of thought into it. But I'm going to give you just a little bit of background. So here, I guess I've been the one to design the block and come up with what we're going to put together. So here's some quilting math. So not to overwhelm you, but to give you a little background on why I'm going to tell you to choose a certain number of dark blues and white blues versus light blues. So that we have a little, since we only have 3 colors of fat quarters, this way we'll have just a little more balance in our blocks as we create them. So because we're working with these 3 colors, I did a little quilting math. So not to overwhelm you, this really, you don't have to worry about this, but some of you might like to see this. So we have here laid out, we have 144 total rectangles that we cut from these fat quarters. We are going to use 96 of those rectangles in the bottom section of the block. So you can see right here. In this bottom section of the block, we're going to use 96 of those rectangles, and then that's going to leave 48 rectangles, 1 for each block, for putting on the top. And so since I have an uneven number of stacks per color, what I'm going to do is just adjust a little bit. So what I did was I thought, okay, we've got 48 blocks, and I need 2 for the bottom section of each block to make 96 rectangles. Well, 96 rectangles divided by our 8 fat quarters, that would be, if we did it evenly, that would be 12 from each of these stacks to make the bottom section of our quilt block. But because I've got only 2 of the light blues, what I'm going to do, and what I'm going to guide you to do if you're using this same fat quarter bundle, is that let's take the dark blues and the whites, and instead of using 12 of all of them, we're going to make a couple of them. We're going to use 14. And on those light blues where we only have 2 stacks, so we have fewer of the light blue rectangles, we're only going to use 8 from each of those, so that when we get to adding our rectangles at the top of our block, we're going to have a few more light blues left to add to the top, and it won't be so dark blue and white top heavy, if that makes sense. All right, so if though you're using a very scrappy fat quarter layout like I showed you kind of in the intro video, if you have one of each color, well, just have fun with it. Use 12 from each, or don't even worry about it. You know, if you're working with 4 colors, you know, the more fat quarter colors you have, the less you're going to have to worry about placement. But because this works out this way, it gives me an opportunity to show you how you can work with some numbers to make your placement just a little more balanced. So again, if you have any questions or you're wondering how you should work with your particular fat quarter bundle, just send me an email or leave me a comment, send me a picture. I'd love to help you. This is what we're doing. We're learning here, and so, you know, I can only teach what I have in front of me. I can't really, I guess I could, but it would be a little unrealistic for me to make 8 different quilts. So I can show you all the possibilities. So with that knowledge in mind, if you're using a bundle like this, what I'm going to do today, just like I showed you, is I'm going to pull out my 96 rectangles that I'm going to start piecing into the bottom of this block. Okay, so depending on what you're working with, you might be pulling out 12 from each stack to make those. You might be just playing with it and going scrappy, but I'm going to pull out 14, 14, 12, 8, and 8. And then we're going to sit down and we are going to start piecing those blocks together. Okay, so just like I was talking about, I'm going to take each of these stacks that have 18 in them, and I'm going to start pulling the rectangles that I want to use for the bottom section of my block. So I'm just going to count out from this light blue, I'm going to count out 12, so that's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 rectangles, and I'm going to set those aside. I should have I have 6 left, and those I'm going to set aside for the top portion of my block. Now these 2 dark rectangle sets I'm going to pull 14 out of. Remember, we were talking about how it's going to be just a little bit more balanced. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14. And I'm going to set those aside to take over to my sewing machine. These are going to get set aside for the tops of the blocks. So I'm going to pull 14 out of here, and then like I discussed, because of my colors of fat quarters, I'm going to pull 8 out of here, 14, 14, and 12. Alright, so here you can see those are my 8 stacks that I have pulled aside to go and make the bottom portion of my block. And I'm going to take those over to the table where my sewing machine is and lay those out. And then over here I have my remaining rectangles from all those stacks that will be the top portion of each block, and I'm going to leave those here on my cutting table, and we will come back to those when we're ready to add them to the block. Let's get started on our sewing. So here's my machine. I had kind of adjusted my lights so they won't be in your way while I'm filming, but I'm set up and ready to sew. I can show you a little bit about what I have set up. We're just using white thread. I have my, this is my 1/4 inch foot or my straight stitch foot on my machine. I have that on, and that's pretty much what I leave on when I'm sewing. Some people have asked, what are the pieces of tape on your machine? they are different guides for me. So there are guides out there. I know Lori Holt has a Seam So Easy guide, and this is my preferred method, and I believe I learned this from Camille Roz Kelly of Thinnable Blossoms, and Bonnie and Camille Fabric is using, then it was painter's tape, or right now I use washi tape, and I have my marks laid out on my machine. You can see that this dark blue here, I mean, I taped this, or tape and retape this, the light blue here, as well as this dark blue here, that's my 1/4 inch guide. This line right here, this gold washi tape, is when I'm doing some diagonals, like when I'm sewing half square triangles, and that keeps me straight when I follow corner to corner on this line. But I'm going to be using my 1/4 inch guide here. Now, some of you have a special foot for 1/4 inch, and that is fantastic. You can use that. You can use something like Lori Holt's Seam So Easy guide. Whatever works, but we are going to want to be sewing a good 1/4 inch seam on all of our parts of our blocks, and as we sew our blocks together. So that's important. So however you ensure that you're getting a 1/4 inch, this is my method, the tape. And then my foot is a little bit of a guide. This tape, the dark line, is really what I'm depending on. Make sure you got a fresh needle. If you've been doing a lot of sewing, you might want to go ahead and change out your needle. I usually change mine for sure after I've quilted a big quilt. I definitely need a new one, and sometimes you can just tell when you need a new needle. You might start kind of seeing some snags in your fabric as you're sewing, or it just doesn't seem to be feeling as smooth. So that is my setup. Like I said, we're going to use white thread. That on my machine back here, my cone of Arfil white thread. And then over here to the left of my sewing machine on a table that I keep nearby, those are my rectangles that we pulled out from the whole set that we're going to use to sew the bottom portion of the quilt together. So I am going to set up my camera, and hopefully it will not be too terribly jiggly. I know my machine sews fast, and I know the kids say they can actually feel it kind of shake the floor. So we'll see how that goes. I'll try and keep it from being too much of a problem. And then we're going to get started sewing here. All right. All right, so let's start putting our blocks together, and I'm going to show you how we're going to get started. And obviously I'm not going to put all the blocks together here for you on camera, but let's get going on some tips and tricks. So you have your stacks of 8 different colored rectangles, and we've sorted those, and we have just enough in each stack to make 48 of the bottom portion of our block. And so since we've already sorted those and we have what we need, and we aren't going to be dipping into our other stacks of rectangles that we left over on the cutting table, you can actually just start pulling rectangles and having fun putting those together. So for my first portion of my first block, I'm going to pick 2 rectangles, and I picked a light blue and one of the dark blue. Now here's the thing, when I'm piecing simple shapes, especially rectangles and squares or strips that have been cut well, I don't pin my pieces together. So I lay my fabrics right sides together, and I take an extra moment to make sure that my my rectangle is all lined up and that it's laying on top of each other perfectly. So if you look here, you can see how there's none of my dark blue showing from underneath. My edges are all lined up, my corners are together, and for me, I'm ready to sew. Now, if you feel uncomfortable not pinning, you can pin, and let me show you how I would do that. If I were going to pin these rectangles before I start sewing my 1/4 inch seams, on these I would probably just add a pin here and a pin here, holding those flat while I lift and push my pin through. Okay, so I have 2 pins in my fabrics, in my 2 rectangles that are right sides together, and then I would proceed to go ahead and piece that. My machine can roll right over the pins, no problem. Some machines cannot handle sewing over pins, and so you would sew up to the pin just before it, take your pin out, and keep going. But I really love piecing without pins. You will see later, as we're piecing our whole quilt top together, I will use pins during that step, because then I'm trying to match up some seams. So really, kind of, if you're really trying to match something up carefully with your seams, you might want to go ahead and use some pins. But when you're just sewing squares or rectangles or strips together and you're not matching anything up, then I would encourage you to try not using pins. So my 2 rectangles are right sides together, and I'm going to start sewing those. So let me bring you a little bit closer here. Okay, so I really am trying to bring you in just a little bit closer here. So here you can see I've got my rectangles, they're ready to go. Got my threads off to the side here. My needle will fall just off my fabric edge over here. I'm going to put my presser foot down. You can just see that I did that. Put my presser foot down. And I'm going to put my needle in the needle down position. A lot of machines have a button to put your needle in needle down position, and especially as you're chain piecing, which is what we're going to do here, that's really, really helpful. And anytime you're piecing, to have your needle in the needle down position. So my needle is down. I'm at the very top edge of my fabric here, and you can see that my fabric is lined up with my tape or the edge of my foot here, and I'm ready to start sewing my 1/4 inch seam. So, you know, take it as slow or as fast as you feel you need to. You can start out slower. I know when I'm piecing, and granted I've been piecing for a very long time, I tend to piece pretty fast. So, but that comes with time. But I do know sometimes that if you try to go too slow, I feel like sometimes going too slow can also keep you from going as straight as you want to. So in a way, I guess there is a balance between going too slow and too fast to keep that seam nice and straight. So I'm just going to use my fingers to hold my pieces of fabric together, and then I'm going to start sewing my seam. And I'm just going to let it run through. Keeping that nice and straight, and I'm just going to sew right off the edge of the fabric. And so that was a light and a dark blue that we just sewed together. Now we're going to chain piece, which means I'm not going to lift my presser foot and lift my needle and trim my thread here. I'm going to keep on sewing, and then once I've sewn all 48 of these bottom portions of our block, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to trim my seams, or not trim my seams, I'm going to clip my threads in between each block. And so that's called chain piecing. It saves thread, it saves time and hand motions, it's much more efficient. So anytime I can chain piece something, I am doing it. So my needle is still down, my presser foot is still down, and that little bottom half of my block that I just sewed a nice 1/4 inch seam on, you can see it here. that, it's just gonna stay right here, and I'm gonna feed this really long string of blocks and keep going. They're gonna fall off the back of my machine, and then when I'm done, I'm gonna clip my threads. And so now I'm gonna pick a light blue. I'm gonna pick a light blue and white. And I'm gonna put those together. I'm gonna line up, I'm gonna do it right here in front of me, line up my edges. I can lift my presser foot a little bit if I need to. And now I've got it all lined up, and I'm ready to start sewing. So right off the edge of the fabric, I sewed another 1/4 inch seam. This time I'm going to do a dark and a white. Gonna line those up. I feel like I need a GoPro for this. Some kind of something on my head. This is in my lap right now and it's working. I'm sorry if it's a teeny bit shaky, but it's working. You can see I just got my next set of rectangles all together. Everything looks good. Mine can slide right under there, and I'm ready to start stitching my next seam. And so a little closer here, you can see about how big my stitches are. You don't want a really tiny stitch, and you don't want a really big stitch. So on my machine, I'm going to move it over here real quick. This is where I can set my stitch length on my machine, and I have it set to a little over 2. Any lower and they become really tiny stitches, and then they become really hard to rip apart if you need to. Any bigger, and they're going to look more like gathering stitches or basting stitches, and you're not going to have nice flat seams. So play with it a little bit, but I think you'll be able to tell, just the right size. And so you can see here that I've got my little kite string of fabrics. And now I'm going to choose another light blue and a dark blue. Now, one thing I'm going to do here, because remember we have fewer of the light blues, I'm going to end up choosing light blues a little less. So most of my blocks are going to be white and dark blue. And sometimes you can make sure as you're going that if you see your fabrics getting a little bit off, you can adjust those and kind of just get them back in line. Alright, this time I'm going to do a light blue and a white. Don't worry, we will end up using all of our light blues that we pulled, but that's going to work out just fine. Okay, I'm going to move the camera angle here so that I can sew without a tripod in my lap. Alright, I'm back and we are ready to keep on sewing. Again, I've got some more a white and a light blue together. Got those nice and even underneath my foot, and I keep sewing. I'm gonna pick a dark and a white this time. Keep on feeding those through until we have all of the rectangles that we've set aside put together. So all 96 rectangles are going to come together to form 48 bottom portions of your block. So let's keep sewing. Okay, so here I am. I have sewn my last 2 rectangles together, and as I do that, I'm going to lift up my presser foot. I'm going to bring my needle up to the up position. I'm going to pull those threads and pull my blocks, and I'm going to snip close to the edge here. And then as you can see, my string of chain pieced blocks just keeps going and going. So that's 48 of them all together that have just been allowed to fall back behind my machine. And so now I'm going to take my scissors and start snipping and making a see that stack of my 2 rectangles that have been sewn together. So I'm just going to keep snipping in between. There should be a little piece of there's a little piece of thread right there, and I am snipping that. Try not to cut your fabric, but I have done that. So just keep snipping all your little threads in between your blocks and pulling those up, or I tend to do them this way instead of if I pull them all into a pile, then oftentimes my little threads will get tangled, and then I'm trying to you know, untangle my blocks. So really I just pull up my little kite string here that fell behind my machine, and or that got bunched up, depends on how your sewing machine's set up, and I just keep snipping and making my little stack over here. So as I was sewing, I sewed some light blues and dark blues together. You'll see as we press and open up our blocks. I sewed some whites and light. I sewed some darks and whites. I sewed some whites together, and I sewed some darks together. It's really not going to make a whole lot of difference in the end. Alternatively, if you really wanted to lay out your rectangles in pairs and be sure that you're pleased with the different combinations ahead of time, do that. Sit down on the floor or work at your table and pardon me, that was a sneeze break. Work at your table and lay out pairs of rectangles and make sure that you are happy with your placement. Or you can do like I'm doing and just pick up rectangles and put them together and know that in the end you're going to have a really fun scrappy quilt. Now, are all patterns this way? No. There are many patterns out there that are very that can be very particular about placing this light next to this dark, or turning a particular block this way or that before you sew it together. So but what I'm showing you here is a little bit scrappy, but if you're not as comfortable with the scrappiness, then by all means lay out your rectangles in pairs on the table and then pick those up and start sewing those together. So Lori Holt, my favorite quilting lady in the whole wide world, said you are the boss of your own quilt. And so I encourage you to remember that as you quilt or stitch or crochet or whatever it is you're decorating your house. This is your hobby, this is your project, this is your quilt, and so you really do have a lot of freedom sometimes in how you want to put that together. So I have my stack here, and we're going to go over to the ironing board and we're going to start ironing, all right, or pressing our seams. I wouldn't call it ironing. Ironing is what you do to a shirt. Pressing is what you do to your quilt seams, all right? So we will meet over at the ironing table. All right, I'm back. My iron has gotten all hot now. It is ready for ironing, and I have my stack of blocks that we put together. So you can open up your pairs and see that you should have 2 rectangles sewn with the beautiful 1/4 inch seam, and so you have 48 pairs of rectangles sewn together. So when you're quilting, you want to pay attention to your pattern directions, and some patterns will have you press a certain direction when you're constructing a block. So always well, always read your whole pattern before you begin, and make sure you understand what the pattern is saying, but then also pay attention in any pattern to whether the designer is telling you to press your seams going a particular direction. So what I mean is that when you take your, I'm going to move these over here, when you take your pieced block here and you flip it over on the wrong side, you're going to see your seam here, right? That's what your seam looks like. And sometimes a pattern will actually tell you to open your seam, to press your seam open, in which case you would take your finger and you would open up your seam and you would press it. Now I'm not going to do that because I don't want to do that with this particular block. So some patterns could tell you to open your seam and press it. Okay, so that is one option. Some might tell you to press it to a particular side or to another side. Okay, but a standard rule of thumb with a lot of quilting, especially if they don't give you any directions one way or another, one rule is be consistent. And really, you know, just pay attention to your pattern and how, usually if it matters how seams are going to match up when you start joining corners, they're going to tell you to iron your blocks in a particular direction. The beauty of this is that we don't really have a pattern where we're going to be matching lots and lots of corners and seams. So what we're going to do is we're going to press each of these blocks toward the darker fabric. So if you look at your block, obviously if you get down here later and you've got two, you know, you've got two whites that are sewn together, well, just pick a side. Or two darks, pick a side. So what I do first is I take my block, fold it up flat like that, and I'm gonna just press a little bit. And that really just kind of sets your stitches into your seam. Notice I'm not going back and forth over my seam. I'm just pressing a little bit. Okay? And then I'm going to take my finger, be careful, it's hot, and I'm going to push this so that my seam is pointing toward the dark side. And as I press that, you can use a seam roller, but then I just kind of put my iron on it and press that seam. Okay, and you have a lovely, well ironed block. Okay, get back over it, make it flatter. Here's another one. First, this is one of the two whites, I'm going to press my seam. Okay, I'm going to open it up. It doesn't matter which way this one goes because we got two whites together, right? Press it with my finger. It's called finger pressing first. And put my iron on and hold it. And I've pressed that block. And I'm just going to start stacking, making a little stack of my pressed blocks. Hold, flip it open. I'm going to make my seam point to the darker side of the fabric, the darker fabric. Finger press a little bit while it's still warm. Watch out, do not burn yourself, but I can't say that quilting accidents don't happen. I had a lot of people in my cutting videos say, oh, I can't believe you didn't close your rotary cutter before you put it down. And yes, in a perfect world, I do try and close my rotary cutter every time I set it down, so that I don't end up picking up my rotary cutter and injuring myself or cutting myself because I've picked it up by the blade or something has happened. So yes, I really, really do intend every single time to close my rotary blade, and thankfully I have never had an accident in that way. Now I have had rotary accidents where I have actually cut over my finger or, you know, odds and ends. So do try and close your rotary blade every time you set it down. But obviously we don't live in a perfect world, and so sometimes we don't do that perfectly either, right? That's where grace comes in, in prayer. Now, if you're very concerned about injuring yourself on your rotary cutter, I would recommend looking at the different cutters out there, the Olfa or Fiskars type cutters that actually only open as you're pressing down to cut. There are some rotary cutters that only the blade pops out only as you push down to cut. So you might be interested in looking at one of those, and that is kind of a more foolproof way of keeping your rotary blade cut every time you set your rotary cutter down. So just be careful and use common sense and do your best. So here we are. We are ironing those blocks, and we are ending up with a nice little over here so you can see it. That's my stack of pressed blocks, and so I am just going to keep setting that seam, finger pressing my block, and give it a good press. Good hot iron, hot as I can get it. You don't want to leave it on there too long, obviously. Kind of like with your rotary cutter, use some common sense. Doesn't take much. Okay, so I'm going to finish pressing all of these blocks open before we move to our next step. Alright, so here is my ironed or my pressed stack of the bottom halves of my blocks, and we are ready to start adding our top sections to our blocks. So let's head over to my table and we'll start working on that. So this portion of your block here that we've just constructed, I'm showing you one of them, should measure 5.5 inches square. Now, if you've done a reasonably good 1/4 inch seam, I'm not going to have you trim these up or square them up, because in the wash, in the end, it's all going to work out and it's going to be just fine. Many patterns will tell you to make sure that after a certain step you square up your block and make sure it's a certain size. That is always good, and actually the better you get with your 1/4 inch seam, the better that's going to work out, and you won't have to do some trimming sometimes. But if you feel the need to here, you can use your ruler and make sure that your blocks are 5.5 inches square and do any little trimming that you need to do around the block. I'm not going to show you that here in this video, because if you've taken your time and done a decent 1/4 inch seam, there shouldn't be any trimming that you need to do, and this should already be about 5.5 inches square. Alright, so these are the blocks we just finished piecing our rectangles and pressing them open. I have a real pretty stack of all those pretty blues and whites. Love them. And then these are the remaining rectangles that we laid aside to add to the top of our blocks to make our completed block. So what I'm going to do this time, because I mentioned that, you know, like when we were sewing these rectangles together, we were kind of just putting them together, the rectangles that we had selected, putting them together, I don't want to say haphazardly, but we didn't necessarily lay them out. And I told you that if you felt more comfortable, you could lay out your pairs of rectangles and make sure you were happy with your color placement and balance before you started piecing these rectangles together. So I guess at this point what I'd like to do is show you that method as we add our rectangles to the top of our blocks. So you can go to the floor, you can go to your dining room table, you can go, you know, wherever you have the space. I don't always have a ton of space, and I want to stay, you know, close by to my machine, so I'll have them spread out all over the place. But if we want to work on choosing these rectangles to, you know, look nice with our other pieces that we've sewn together, we are going to first lay out all these 48 rectangles that we just sewed. So I'm going to pick these up and set those aside. Okay, so you can see that I've got all those blocks that we pieced together. I've got those laid out here on my cutting table, and if you look carefully over here, that's my ironing board. I have them laid out over there as well. And so with them laid out like this, I can go ahead and take my other rectangles. Sometimes I'm running out of room here. I'm just gonna stack my other rectangles here in my hand so I can kind of see what I got. Or if you have another table space, you can kind of lay these there and figure things out. So what we're doing is we're taking our remaining rectangles and we're going to start just matching them to the blocks. And so you're going to have some that may have a dark, and a light, and that's going to still look really pretty together. I'm going to pull a real pretty white, floral to go with that one. I'm going to put a lighter one here. I'm going to pull a light blue to go here, and so on and so forth. I'm going to keep pulling, do a white with a white and a blue. I'm going to keep pulling out rectangles from my stack and adding those to the blocks until I have a rectangle matched up with each block. And then I'm going to just, look around and make sure I'm happy with my placement and that everything comes out even in the end. So I'm just going to keep doing that until I have one of these leftover rectangles matched up with the block that we've already sewn. And feel free to move them around. If you don't like this one here, okay, well, I think I want to put that one over here instead, and have things balanced out. So I use this method a lot when I'm putting blocks together to kind of make my decisions as to what's going to go where. So it's still scrappy, but it's a little planned scrappy. So I would encourage you to just work with this and move things around and play with that until you've got it like you want to. So I'm going to finish doing that myself. So hopefully that little bit of time lapse was helpful. I got all these sorted the way I like them. I wasn't too particular. We have some where we've got a dark blue, and a white. We've got a light, and a dark. I think I've got a white, and a light. What's going to happen is when we start arranging these blocks into our quilt top, we're gonna play with the layout and the movement and the placement of the darks and the lights. And you can already tell by looking at the blocks kind of stacked and laid out here as they are just right now, how beautiful all these blues and whites are going to look together, even if a dark and a light is touching or a little close or something like that. It's really fun, and I love a quilt that is scrappy. I love a quilt that is planned scrappy. They're probably my favorite kind of quilt. So what we're going to do now that you've laid these out, and this is just a common thing you would do, you would have done this on the first one, is I'm going to stack my blocks. And so I like to alternate. So I'm kind of putting one regular, one stack on point, one that way, one stack on point. And I'm just going to keep stacking these sets of rectangles together, alternating, so that when I take this stack over to my sewing machine, I'm just going to pick up a set of 3, and I'm going to match, I'm going to put it right sides together, and I'm going to sew that next seam. So keep stacking up your blocks the way they're the way that you've got them all matched up, and then we're going to go over and we're going to do some more sewing. All right, here we are. We are back at the sewing machine. I got my little snips here. Talked about those in my quilting essentials, and those are always, right here. That's what I clip my threads with. And here is that stack of blocks. We've got our one matched rectangle with our pieced portion of our block, and I've got that beautiful just love it, that beautiful stack of blues and whites here. And just playing with them and laying them out and doing this piecing gets me all excited. I love playing with fabrics, and it makes me just want to quilt all the things, right? So I'm going to set my stack of blocks to my side here, and we're going to start piecing this portion together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of those sets that I stacked up. I have my pieced portion that we just did, and I have my matched rectangle. I'm going to flip this rectangle over right sides together, and it should match up. This rectangle should be about as long as your pieced block underneath. Okay, so and you know, if you were to get right up to mine, is it absolutely, completely perfect corner match? Is it exactly the same length? No. Because I don't live in a perfect quilting world, and I've made enough quilts to know that especially when you're working with basic layouts like this, that a lot of times, you know, it's going to turn out just fine. All your blocks are going to go together, you're going to quilt it, and it's going to be beautiful. So I will match that up as best I can, and I'm going to, again, if you feel comfortable pin it. If not, then we're going to put it under our presser foot, put my presser foot down, it's up, I'm going to put it down, and I'm going to lower that needle into place, and I am going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, adding this rectangle to the block that I've already pieced. Now, as I get to the area, and you will be able to feel it, and if you wanted to pin, this would be a good place to put a pin, is right here where that seam is underneath that you sewed, this seam right here. But you're sewing, you can feel it coming up, you can feel the bump. Remember, your seam is going one way or another. And I just like to put my finger there and make sure that my seam is getting held down underneath. I'm keeping a finger down here, keeping my block all lined up. Carefully running that through, just a little slower. And now I'm going to finish all the way to the edge. I'm going to grab my next one off the stack. There's my rectangle. There's my pieced one. Turn this one this way because ultimately it's not going to make any difference, so kind of play around with your placement. I'm going to line that up, a nice straight edge, get it lined up as best I can, put that under, sew my seam, slow down a little bit as I get to where that seam is underneath, make sure it's held in place, and run it through. Okay, let me switch camera angles so you can watch from the other direction. Okay, here we are, camera in my lap again. This is fun, this is entertaining. Okay, so here's my my rectangle, my block I just pieced. I'm going to turn this one this way just because I want to. Hopefully you can see this. I'm lining this up. Try and get my corners matched. Get my seam looking pretty all the way down. Adjust that a little bit. Sometimes I can pull my fabrics or press and move just a little bit. Put those under the... Slow down a little bit, make sure my seam's in the right place. Keep sewing my 1/4 inch. Okay, here we go. Another one. Going to match that up. Match up my corner up here. Okay, make sure my seam looks pretty all the way down. Match up my corner. Kind of hold it in place, put it under. Start sewing my 1/4 inch seam all the way down. And you'll notice again that I am chain piecing these. I'm going to rotate just a little bit here. Oops, I picked up, gotta be careful, picked up a rectangle from below. But here I've got another rectangle, a pretty block that I've done. I am line that up, make it pretty as best I can. You can see that. Make my corner a little nice. And then here we go. Make sure you're holding that seam down as you get close to it. Alright, let's do one more here before I finish. See, look here, I've got 2 whites and a pretty blue. And match that up. Match up my corner there. If you want to pin, you can pin. It is your quilt, your blocks. Do what you feel comfortable with. Alright, I finished piecing all my blocks together. Here's my little kite string. I'm going to cut those apart like I did last time and make a stack, and then we're going to go over and press. Alright, here we are at the ironing table again. I am back, and I have this beautiful, beautiful stack of pieced blocks here. We did our last bit of sewing to piece these blocks together, and now we are going to press very much like we did before. You can take one of your blocks, and before you open it up, you're going to use your iron to press that seam there and set those stitches. Again, you're going to roll that up, finger pressing a little bit before you use your iron and press that seam open. We are pressing our seam toward the top rectangle, and if you printed off that sheet or did a screenshot of my diagram that I showed you earlier, you would see an arrow going one direction down here showing, and I told you we're going to press to the dark side on this one, and then you would see an arrow pointing this direction on the diagram, which then shows you that we are going to press our seam up. So my seam is facing up toward this top rectangle. Okay, so again, there's one. Make myself a pretty stack. Finger press. It is hot. I think I have hands of, oh, as my dad used to call my feet, asbestos feet. I could walk on the hot ground outside. I think I have asbestos hands by this point in my life as well. But do be careful. It can be a little hot. If you want to wait a few more seconds before you put your fingers on it, by all means, please do. Don't call me. You know, use your judgment, right? Use your judgment. Okay, you might want to wait just a minute. All right, then you can start finger pressing. There are rollers you can use, but I'm just kind of, the fewer gadgets, I do better. Press, roll it up, that seam going toward the top, right? Press, and press that seam up. So you are going to do this with all the blocks, and while I work here for just a little bit longer, we're going to just take this opportunity to chat a bit while we press. Feels like we're sitting here having our little quilts along together, right? So I just kind of wanted to say here that kind of my caveat or my sewer beware, but am I going to be able to teach you everything that you need to know in this quilting video? No. Are there going to be things that I don't do as well as other quilters? Yes. There are so many talented quilters out there, so many that are far more talented than I am. And all I'm trying to do here is offer you a little bit of what I've learned over the last 20 years. And if it's imperfect, it's imperfect, because I am not a perfect quilter. My friend Annie from The Proper Stitcher, who is doing this quilt along with me, I love her motto for her cross stitch, which is instead of, essentially get your projects finished. A finished project is, a finished imperfect project is better than a piece of stitching that you worked hard on that's just sitting in a drawer languishing. And so she encourages everyone to, finish those pieces, and maybe they won't be perfect, but you'll have this beautiful finished piece. And so just that, not aiming for perfection. There are going to be times in a quilt when I'm a little more careful, where I have to do a little more trimming or squaring up, where it matters a little bit more how I press. But what I want to show you here today in any of these videos is just kind of me in action, how I quilt. What does it really look like when I quilt? And not the perfect edited version, but the, let's be real about this. So I hope this is helpful to you. Let's finish ironing or pressing, excuse me, these blocks, and then we'll wrap it up for today. All right, welcome back to the end. We made it. I'm so proud of you. I know that that was a lot of work, especially if you are just beginning, but you did great, and I'm so excited that we've made it this far and got all our blocks pieced together. Our blocks are all done and ready to go. So again, if you need to, feel free to look below and print off this diagram, the PDF version of that. And then look, we have this beautiful pieced and pressed stack of 48 blocks all together. We've got some that are, I was looking at them. It's always fun. I always like to press things because it's fun to look at. It's fun to look at all the blocks as you go along. To me, that's part of the fun. Is admiring all the fabrics. And so I was kind of looking at them as I pressed. Hold on, let me find one here I wanted to show you. And that the differences in the blocks that you will have come up with as you have put these together. So ideally, I mean, we would all think, oh, that's a perfect little block right there. We've got a nice dark one, we got a light blue, and we got a white here on the side. Oh, what a perfect little block. But you're going to see this next time, that as we lay out this quilt, this kind of scrappy, plain scrappy quilt, if all the blocks looked like this, then you'd have a much more defined geometric pattern, right? If every block had a dark on the top and a light like this, which some quilts may, that's fine, but you're going to have a much more defined, organized geometric pattern if they're all the same. What's going to happen as we start putting these blocks together is that you're going to have some that maybe have two darks and a light, and then put that next to some with, and you're going to have a beautiful, beautiful blue and white scrappy quilt that I think it's just going to be lovely. I'm really excited. I know I showed you my first blue and white quilt that I made, my first real quilt that I made, and my first installment of this series. And you could see there that, you know, whites were next to each other and dark blues, and the overall effect of a quilt is just beautiful. And so here we have maybe some blocks that have whites and a dark blue. Here we've got a white on top and a dark and a light down here. Here we've got a light blue with a dark and a white. And, you know, there's some with dark and a white. There's one with a dark on the top and two white. So what's going to happen is that this is going to give a really pleasing, to me, scrappy look to our quilt as we lay it out. Aren't they beautiful? I'm so excited. These are just gorgeous. So this is where we're going to stop for today. You've done a lot of work. So you can arrange this a little straighter if you want to. Just keep your nice stack of pressed blocks all together. And I will see you the next time, and we will start laying this out and arranging rows and putting all that together to make our finished quilt top. And again, if you have any questions or comments or things weren't clear, please leave me a loving, kind comment down below, or send me an email and I'd be happy to help you. And remember, I'm not a perfect quilter, but I love what I do, and I got lots of quilts, and it's a fun hobby. It is a treasure the heirlooms that I've gotten to make, and not all of them are perfect. Not all of them turn out as I'd hoped, but but gosh, I enjoy it. So don't stress, don't overthink it, have fun, and I will see you next time as we start to put our quilt top together. Bye, and have a blessed couple of weeks.